Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we're here with Bill for the second edition of this webinar for Module 2. We're going to be talking about determining your carbon footprint and managing emissions. I will not make you lose any precious time, so I'll now leave the floor to Bill. There will be space for question at the end, so don't worry.
Okay. Maria, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming today. We've got what I trust will be an exciting presentation and also something that will enable you to take away for your own personal or business use some guidelines and insights into this incredible challenge, which is also, may I add, an incredible business opportunity. So it's both sides of the ledger. And let's get moving forward without any further delay. Here's an outline of what we're going to chat about today. The importance of planning and understanding why, the difference between the two key objectives of carbon footprint management, that is achieving carbon neutral and net zero. And again, there's a lot of confusion in the industry, and the language very often gets rather imprecise, and we need to get a good understanding of what these terms mean. Also, things such as carbon credits and carbon offsets as business assets, we want to take a brief look into that, how they fit into your business plan. This also is a language challenge because the two terms tend to be used very often interchangeably, and they're very different assets. And then the overriding and overarching framework, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. This language is really universal globally in the sustainability arena. And it references, if you will, the three levels of what one has to do in planning and managing your footprint and the emissions, each one representing an area wherein the emissions show up, and each one as well kind of sequentially. We're going to talk a lot about Scope 1 today because we have not enough time to get in depth on the other two. But I do want to introduce you to that because it is an overarching and comprehensive framework for approaching emissions management. I've also put up a YouTube video. When you have a chance, it's a short one, but it's insightful. Please, you might want to just jot down the reference. I can also, once you send me in the chat box in the Q&A, we can talk a little bit about it, and I can send you this reference in an email as well. So Scope 1, which we will talk about, is about the direct emissions from your organization's operations, or even from your home. So if you're here just as a personal citizen wanting to gather more information, we're going to touch on issues that are relevant for you as well. Basically, Scope 1 is the easiest one to begin to develop your carbon footprint, and that's really where you should begin. And then once you get accustomed to it and have the systems in place, you can move more readily to Scope 2 and then to Scope 3. So essentially, Scope 1 are those within the organization that it has direct control over and responsibility, and we'll talk about what some of those are. Scope 2, which we'll reference from time to time, but not delve into directly, pertains to indirect emissions resulting from, let's say, electricity you purchased from the outside, all right? Heating, cooling that you purchased. So you have indirect control, and that requires slightly different strategies and management approaches. And then finally, the most comprehensive, Scope 3. And this is the one where the greatest share of the emissions challenge, the carbon emissions challenge, originates and continues, because it is the entire process of creating the value chain the product or service in which you are involved. Think of it as both an upstream and a downstream process that you have to somehow create a management system which understands all of the components. And systems thinking is very, very important here. The interdependency of all the parts. So let's say we use Apple as an example. Um, Scope 3 would involve emissions from all the raw materials that go into, say, an iPhone. So that would be the first way in which you, as someone, let's say, who was involved with the distribution even of those phones, would have to have some idea as to the degree to which Apple was understanding and properly formulating standards in terms of raw material extraction and what have you. Second, think about the energy that's used in the production. Apple, for example, would have to register and evaluate and basically determine the footprint for production. So that's the second variable in Scope 3. The third is the logistics of shipping. For example, if you ship by overseas and you use sea lanes, it's a lot less emissions than if you have to rush the product in because you're late in delivery and you have to use air freight. So you've got these variables even in shipping and distribution. Is it trucking? Is it trains? And again, it gets quite complex. And complex doesn't necessarily mean complicated if you have a systems thinking framework and you approach it as a system of interdependent components that interface with each other. The fourth would be the usage. For example, you get your Apple phone home and you charge it, right? Or the electricity that you use basically it generates carbon emissions. And that's the overriding, I think, frame of reference and, if you will, mindset I'd like you to take away from this webinar. It's all about energy and the degree of energy we use to transform the power it has into a lifestyle and into products and services by which we enjoy that lifestyle. So it's an energy issue, and that's what we're trying to get our arms around. What is the best clean energy? Is there such a thing? And how do we go about, again, measuring and managing? And in the final analysis, and this is the really good news, it's really also an asset that's tradable once you've done the first two. And finally, the last part of the Scope 3, and using Apple again, what happens in terms of recycling the old iPhones? What do we do with them? How do we dispose of them in a way that it doesn't lend itself back to carbon emissions excess? So don't forget, there are batteries inside the phones. And, the phone is fundamentally an encased battery. And when you think of it that way, you have to realize that there are emissions that nitric oxide that come out of batteries that are no longer in use and are disposed of. So we've got these 5, if you will, interdependent components in the system, which we designate as Scope 3. And this is the most challenging of all systems. And for example, one of the things we'll reference a little bit, and we talk about this in other webinars in more detail, but if you take a look at something like Italian fashion manufacturing and luxury and premium, the very nature of the supply system and the product development system have layers, yes, of a small and very, very creative craftsmen. And very often family-owned businesses, 2, 3 generations. And they're very often handoffs in terms of how the product is finally produced and manufactured, where different segments do different parts, and segments are in different companies. So you have this real challenge. How do we get these companies to adhere to one set of standards by which the mother company says, this is where we stand in Scope 3 emissions management. And here's the evidence, certified evidence, confirmed evidence that what we say publicly, we have support in terms of our supply partners. So that's the first, if you will, approach that I'd like to present, the overview. Let's move into this in a little more detail together. To give you an idea of where in the US the major carbon footprint problems exist, or at least the generation of it exists, you can see it's electric power, industry, and transportation are really the major components in our industrial system. Now, it's not to say that the others are irrelevant. They're just smaller by the fact that they are different types of carbon users and electric users. But this is just a snapshot, and I'll give you some of these as we go along, so you get a good idea of the big picture here as well. So again, when we say a carbon footprint, what are we saying? We're talking about a measurable quantity of greenhouse gases, and it's expressed in tones, and that's usually the UK or the EU spelling, or tons, which is the US spelling, produced as a result of business operations. And I don't say a carbon here, I say GHG because there's methane, there's nitric oxide, there's other gases. But for our purposes and for the general purpose of how you proceed in managing, you really want to focus on carbon because that's the major source of greenhouse gas. And usually the business operation will compute the measurement on an annual basis. You can do it product by product. There's very, very good, for smaller businesses, software available, and it's free. There's a lot of very free and very effective software packages. And for larger businesses, one ought to consider outside decarbonization specialists because you have so many more moving parts. And you've got to run your business every day. And you really ought to bring in somebody who can give you a plan, and then you can monitor and learn from the plan. We also recommend here that you try not to use an Excel sheet because posting by, so to speak, hand, as opposed to software that does it automatically, can create errors. And in addition, if you do it monthly or quarterly, you tend to avoid errors more readily than if you do it annually. And the other issue of annually is gathering all of the data from the sources that have generated the carbon footprint and the emission. So annual may seem like, okay, I'll get to it when I get to it, but that really leaves you open to really having to go about finding all the information, and that's when errors tend to occur. The problem with errors is not simply that you're stating something that is incorrect, but there are serious issues, both in terms of regulations and in terms of brand integrity. You don't want to say things to your consumers and to your clients, which fundamentally is not certified or supportable and is untrue, even if it was an error that you've made without intent. So you've got a brand issue and an issue that the brand, you don't want to tarnish the brand's equity. Then you've got the issue of regulations where there are fines, and they can be considerable, and there are standards which you need to incorporate into your business plan and operations. So it's really important that you make a decision right off the top. Am I going to use an Excel sheet, or am I going to really get the software? How am I going to operationalize it? Is it product by product? And if it is it every month? Is it every quarter? Quarterly is okay. And that's probably the best compromise between an annual analysis and a monthly analysis. All righty, let's move forward. This is a kind of fun visual. Everyone says, and it's perfectly understandable, what is a ton of carbon dioxide. How do you possibly envision this in some way? I mean, it's a gas. Well, here's a graphic which I hope is kind of fun and also gives you a sense of the enormity of 1 ton. And 1 ton, however you spell it, is the usual measurement by which the various practitioners of decarbonization use. Everything is measured in terms of a ton. That's sort of the minimum point of departure in measurement in this space. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Again, this is a summary. This is some detail about the summary I gave you earlier. CO2 in the atmosphere is the largest, 85% of damaging emissions. Now, as I indicated, there's methane, nitric oxide, and others about 15%. The other good news is much of the software will translate these gases, the 15% sector, into carbon. So that translation ends up going into the ton management and into the ton measurement. And that keeps you from having to wonder, well, how much methane am I emitting, how much nitric acid? It gets away from that problem. And that's the beauty and power of the software. I should add that methane is this sort of unknown gas that gets into the atmosphere and then has more resiliency in remaining there than even the CO2. So even though it's a small amount, it is very impactful in terms of the adverse effects of it in the atmosphere. Something to think about. And you ready for this? Methane is really most likely to be emitted from cows and pastures. Somebody said you shouldn't be eating too much steak anymore, from steers and pastures on ranches that turn into steaks. But maybe that's taking it too far. That's, of course, up to you. But not only in terms of the the emissions from the steers and cows themselves, but also pasture land is cleared, which means the trees have to be cleared. And again, forests and trees are one of the great absorbers of CO2 from the atmosphere in terms of if you will, control, nature's control of excess carbon. So the more we clear the land, the less we have nature as an ally in our effort to secure more control over the atmospheric gases. Again, just so you don't feel you're losing something in terms of tons or tons in terms of the language, or if you do business in the EU or UK and you see a different tonnage, you'll notice that the difference between how US measures and, if you will, labels, and the UK and the EU is very, very minor. And so therefore, they're fairly comparable in terms of the standard. Remember also that the fact you may be a business organized in the United States and incorporated in the United States, if you do any business in the UK or the EU, where the standards are much more demanding in terms of all of these various controls and protocols, you really have to keep up with those as well. And that's a very important part of it. I know it increases your daily responsibility, but you ought to have someone or something in your company that keeps an eye on the standards as they come out of Europe and the UK. In addition, the SEC in the US and the FTC, which of course are involved both in sustainability, advertising, and marketing, and have standards to make sure you're not greenwashing, meaning making claims you can't substantiate. The EU tends to be the standard by which the SEC in the US and the FTC here look to the future. So it really means that at some point in time, we're going to catch up with the EU. So you might as well get ahead of where the FTC and the SEC may well be going. Finally, there are footprint calculators. You don't have to go this alone. I have, again, label these two at the bottom here. There's some hyperlinks. I'm not going to open them now because it will take us way out of the time frame we have. Excuse me. But please, again, if you can't take a snapshot of this with your own iPhone or jot it down, I will send it to you. Just send me an email, and I'd be happy to send these and any other references you would like to get more information on to you. All right, let's keep moving forward. I kind of like this because it gives you the comprehensive snapshot. This is just a building's carbon footprint. Let's say it's your business headquarters. Think of it that way for a moment. And this is almost the life cycle of a single building's carbon footprint. And it runs all the way, you'll notice, from manufacturing emissions, which we talked about, scope one. And in a sense, this is all scope one because these are components of it. Transportation emissions, if these are your own trucks or cars or trains or whatever, or planes. Installation emissions, that is, creating the installation of products to create the building. One of the issues, for example, is concrete. Incredible amount of CO2 emissions from the very manufacture of concrete. You ready for this? Should you demolish the building at the end, to the end of life emissions of the concrete. Concrete is one of the real challenges we have in building, and we're really focused on how we make an incredibly important building component less of a carrier and a continuance of CO2 emissions. Finally, the operational carbon, or the middle, if you will, energy consumption to operate the building, lighting, heating, cooling, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But again, this gives you, I think, a nice snapshot of a single building and how many points of pressure points, so to speak, there are, and what we need to be aware of in thinking about our responsibility in all of these various sectors. All right, these are just some data points, but I think you get the sense. And again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint as well. So don't worry about the detail, but you can see that we've done a lot of work of trying to create some sort of perspective, because again, the very sense of thinking about CO2 in the gas, we want to understand what it means. What do these numbers mean? One of the ways we understand fundamentally is to compare with something we know, and we get a better understanding of something we don't quite have our arms around as yet. All right, so we want to get out, and what do? Let's say we have a hotel in Barbados. Not a bad idea. If we can get there. But here's a simple chart of what they need to think about in terms of their operations. Obviously, it's a resort, it's a vacation spot, air conditioned, and it's in the tropics or in the Caribbean. So air conditioning is going to be a huge carbon emissions focal point. But by the same token, general equipment, lawnmowers, right? Things of that nature, lawn blowers, if you will, to keep the walks clear, lighting, obviously, kitchen and refrigeration becomes a big, we need to watch it. How much energy are we consuming? Pool pumps, and you can get the idea, water, laundry, because obviously it's resort, towels and sheets and what have you. And this is the kind of fundamental thinking that in your own business, it doesn't obviously have to be a hotel. You begin to section out where you need to look for in terms of energy usage, and the fact that that energy may well be emitting carbon. And our responsibility, of course, is to get our arms around that carbon. All right, so as I said earlier, why understand your carbon? Well, Obviously, you want to reduce your environmental impact. Um, Again, for your own sense of, what you need to do to leave behind a better place than you found it. But from a very pragmatic business point of view, you want to meet the regulatory rules. You want to avoid the penalties, which could be significant. You want to build brand and business goodwill. And as we'll see in Module 6, we go into this in great detail, but you can transform carbon into a revenue stream and a profitable add-on to your bottom line. Carbon trading is a real trading reality, and it's getting bigger and bigger globally. So there's a lot of very concrete business self-interest, if you will, in getting your arms around this idea of carbon measurement and mitigation. All right, to do that, you need to prepare a written plan. This can't be in your head, and it has to be very specific. All of the agencies, the regulatory agencies, and many of the independent certification agencies have very specific guidelines as to what a plan means. So timelines, processes, milestones are all critical. And again, you'll be able to find in some of the information I'm giving you and will give you, where do I find all of this? Where are these protocols? How do I integrate them into my business? And again, we're doing some of that today, but more of that to follow. The key is the transparency and the degree of transparency. And that keyword up there, reporting, should be in bold, because how you report publicly impacts the perception of the company and its brand, and whether or not the regulatory commission feels that you have adhered to the protocols and you have certified and assessed your admissions claims and your control and mitigation claims. And if not, greenwashing can be a very severe imposition upon your business and its goodwill, as well as its revenue and the fine that can become attached. So we've got industry watchdogs out there that are independent. There are some that watch your advertising if you're big enough, and you don't even realize you're being assessed because they're committed as nonprofits to bring to public awareness what is proper and what they might consider to be a violation of what are becoming global protocols. All right, so understanding and planning begins with a real tricky issue, words. Let's take a step back for a moment. There's no Webster's dictionary of sustainability terms. And this may sound like an unimportant fact, but it creates enormous difficulty because people are defining and using language in different ways. And the language isn't simply a conversation. It has very serious implications in terms of the impact on your business. If you use a word and you use it in the wrong way or meaning, you basically then go out and do a policy or do a program, but it's based on the wrong idea because you misunderstood the concept and its consequences. So language becomes really important. We need to know what it means, in what conditions it means what it means, and we need to always ask the question by drilling down a little deeper when someone says, are you carbon neutral? Are you planning to become net zero? And if so, when? So let's take a look at these words and let's get an idea of what it means. All right, so they seem to be similar, but in both cases, the companies are working to reduce and balance their carbon footprint. Now, the Paris COP15 Accords fundamentally set and again, this was signed by 196 nations, And it's a binding treaty, and we'll talk in a moment about what binding means. But setting goals of carbon neutral by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So we've got, in a sense, two gradations here, two steps almost. And most companies want to attempt to follow those steps and not simply leapfrog over carbon neutral into net zero without following the sequence. The reason being is that you learn as you go, and more importantly, perhaps, you need to build a foundation and then move, if you will, to the net zero edifice, so to speak. So carbon neutral here refers to balancing out your total carbon emissions. Net zero means no carbon was emitted from the get-go, and so no carbon needs to be captured or offset. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. More language, by the way, more things for us to have to try to understand here. But we'll do it. We can do it, and we have done it. So, for example, if a company is running entirely on solar and is not using fossil fuels to heat or to air condition its building or to run its computers, it can label its energy as zero carbon. All right? But it can't claim it's carbon neutral. And people will do that sometime because it seems like a reference which describes what their everyday understanding, their common understanding of the language means. It's different. This is a specialized language which changes the meaning with its application. So it's crucial that we understand when we talk about net zero carbon or emissions. Emissions refers to the actual balance, all right, in terms of what's produced and what's taken out of the atmosphere. So net zero means we've stopped adding to the burden of climate heating gases in the atmosphere. We're in that state, really, of neutrality, believe it or not. But it's not carbon neutral. It's net zero carbon. All right, so we talked a little bit earlier about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But let me give you another case. We talked about Apple before. Carbon emissions control and carbon neutral. Everyone wants to get, again, to net zero. So Google just a few weeks ago announced it's no longer carbon neutral. And you say, well, how did they suddenly just announce that? Well, they've been going to carbon neutral and purchasing all these offsets, and I'll talk about what they mean in a moment. But it wants to now get to net zero carbon emissions by 2030. So it's really moved up this entire calendar. And the question is, how does it do this? And here's the real challenge. You've got to not only figure out ways to slow down what's going on in the atmosphere in general, but you have to look at your own business. Is your business growing in certain directions that no matter what you do to increase your mitigation, the very growth of your business increases the emissions? Let me give you the classic example. Artificial intelligence. One image generated by a computer through artificial intelligence consumes, if you will, what it takes for you to charge your smartphone. Now think of all the smartphones that are being charged across the world. So artificial intelligence is enormously energy, if you will, energy focused. It takes huge amounts of energy to generate the power of AI. Now, here's the rub. Google's total planet warming emissions in 2023 were 80 or 48% higher than their benchmark, which they set in 2019. Why? Again, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So this suggestion that suddenly they're going to leapfrog, one has to take a very serious look at this. Because if we're continuing to promote AI and machine learning, then the energy consumption is going to increase in leaps and bounds. And so to go past carbon neutral and shorten, if you will, as well, the span of years to net zero is a very questionable target. And that raises issues of greenwashing, which opens up the doors to regulatory surveillance. Microsoft was not much better, 29% increase in admissions in a similar period. So what does Microsoft do? They have just contracted to purchase 3 Mile Island, if you will, in Pennsylvania. You perhaps remember the nuclear disaster there in, I think, 79. But it's been lying dormant there all these years, this nuclear power facility, which does not generate carbon dioxide emissions. So they have just purchased it from their owners, I think, for $2.1 billion. And they are going to have it operational in 2 years. So they realize, I think, I'm not saying Google doesn't, but Microsoft says it can't, if it's going to continue to promote and to be part of AI and machine learning, it can't possibly make its goals in carbon control and net zero unless it has direct sources of energy, which are not carbon sensitive. And that's, of course, nuclear, as well as solar, of course, and wind and hydroelectric. Those are fundamentally your 4 sources: wind, solar, hydroelectric, and nuclear. Okay, so it gives you, I think, some some case examples, and it gives you, I think, an introduction to the challenge that we have here. But at least I think Microsoft is closer to what's important. All right, so let's take a brief look at the distinctions between the admissions and net zero and, if you will, the carbon neutral. The Accords set these standards, which everyone signed. Now, this is a binding international treaty. The issue, however, again, is that there is no police force, there is no regulatory agency that can force or punish, right? The 197 or 96 signatories to this treaty. So fundamentally, its enforcement comes from peer review and peer pressure and a publicly pledged obligation to move to a certain or to hit certain goals. And that's what's really important here, is that you've got at least the international community which can put pressure, that you've made a public statement, you've written out a public plan, and non-adherence could also lead to to certain trade consequences and certain other banking, if you will, penalties, but not penalties in the sense of a fine. The Paris Accord and the international treaties, which the UN, by the way, has been organizing through the COP various protocols and meetings, there's no way the UN has any authority other than a moral authority and peer pressure. So it's important, however, that we have it out there, because without it, we have nothing as a demand issue. And this sets that demand and sets very, very objective standards, which have been agreed to. All right, so finally, goodwill, brand equity, net zero as a balance sheet asset creates measurable, tradable value from what was an imposition on people's and planet's well-being. That is the whole idea of carbon emissions. And we come to the idea of the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. And those are the sort of new mantras, the new benchmarks, the new language by which many investment houses and businesses are beginning to think in terms of moving toward carbon emissions management and mitigation. All right, so let's just have a quick review and to get this language issue. Carbon neutral is really the amount of GHG produced is less to or equal than the amount removed from the atmosphere. Carbon negative, if you emit less than zero carbon, um, I mean, you can't emit a negative amount of carbon, but being carbon neutral refers to the net emissions you create. So you'll also hear the term carbon positive. Why? It's a marketing term. And you have to be very, very careful because it's the same thing as carbon negative, but it sounds more positive. This is the kinds of mistakes that tend to go out into the marketplace in marketing and advertising. So I would recommend that we not use it no matter how positive it sounds because it's misleading when most of the world is using this kind of language. We've got to move towards some sort of consistency. Again, we don't have a Webster's Sustainability Dictionary, but boy, we certainly and sorely need one. All right, this is really the final kind of lesson in language and what have you. And I almost want to apologize, but we've got to be, again, conversant with the words. Here's another issue of how language kind of gets used inappropriately. You'll hear carbon credits and you'll hear carbon offsets used interchangeably. They're not the same. And here's the other problem. Carbon credits is usually, not usually, but often used as the headline, yes, or the category. And under it, again, carbon credits is a particular thing, which its details are indicated, and then carbon offsets. So it's both a category word as well as a particular type of emissions value. And that creates huge amounts of confusion. But at least if you're aware of it, you can ask the question, are you talking about the category or you're talking about the particular type of emission? And that really, I think, puts you in a different field because it shows you're aware that there are issues in the language. So carbon offsets, such as planting trees in the Amazon, because the trees do absorb CO2, are fundamentally proxies. You could also, for example, want to do biodiversity investment, put your money there. But you're fundamentally paying for other people to then use their carbon mitigation techniques. So you're not changing anything with offsets. You're not lowering your emissions. You're giving money to other people who are specialists in the area of mitigation. And the whole question there, and again, we can't get into the detail, how do we determine that the offsets are in fact being used? How can we be clear that the standards and protocols are being followed? Because don't forget, this is an accounting technique, as is carbon credits. Who are the accountants? Just as we don't have an indicator from the lexicon people, we don't have a dictionary. By the same token, we don't have, if you will, an international accounting standard or an international organization has the authority to go out and, if you will, do audits. You've got to engage the auditor. And that's, of course, something you can do. But very often people don't want to pay it or don't know who to go to or where they are the best, and if you will, how to go about engaging. So offsets have been used a lot, for example, in the fashion industry. They're used very often in gas and oil industries. And again, they're a temporary fix. I always say they're really a bandage on a gash. And you can buy time with them. But if it leads you to avoid your responsibility to lower your emissions, the perfect scenario here, what we need to begin to think about, how do we decrease the CO2 in the atmosphere while we reduce our emissions? They're both, of course, are connected, aren't they? But we have to do them in tandem. And that's, of course, the grand design that we all should be signing off on. So you can take a look at this. Offsets are voluntary, credits are involuntary. And this is the other part that I've been talking about, regulatory and governmental regulations. The governments are putting standards on how much emissions you can, in fact, emit, depending on the nature and size of your business. So it's here to stay. It's not something you can avoid. And it's something that I think it's important that we all begin to put into our business operations. All right, and finally, by conclusion, and we can open it up to questions. This is just the summary of what I've talked about. Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Scope 1 here on the left, direct owned emissions. And Scope 2, indirect purchased emissions. And the most complicated ones and the ones that create, if you will, and the most sleepless nights for business owners is the Scope 3. And with that, I have concluded. So I'd like to open this up, if we can, to any questions that you might have. And I trust that we can take it from there. No open questions. Okay, do you want to post anything? We've got the participants here. I'm happy for the next 15 minutes. Okay. Wonderful. Please feel free to ask any question that you might. You can open up. You can just ask me the question directly. That's fine. No need to post it in the chat box.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Federico.
Hi. I had a question about the public transport.
Yes.
That is, according to your scheme, the major responsible for carbon emission. Do you think that turning the vehicles from, gasoline alimented to electric alimented could cause an actual dropping in carbon emissions, or do you think that producing energy to, recharge these vehicles would affect either way the production of carbon dioxide?
It's an excellent point, Federico. And it raises the issue that is a persistent issue. With every advance, there's a risk reward. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
And you've described it quite well. You've got to charge those, and that means energy. So and again, the other thing is we have to be systems thinking. You don't create energy that's going to create more CO2. So there has to be a complementary change in the source of the energy. You can't keep having coal burning, if you will, producers of power. We have to stop thinking of supply chains, for example. That is a mistaken language, which leaves us with the old sense that you have these sort of disconnected links. We have to start thinking by systems, interdependent components, all of which have to be on the same wavelength, yes? Committed to the same protocols, or else the risk reward doesn't compute. You make progress and you make 2 steps forward and maybe a step and a half backwards. Am I making sense, Federico?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Okay. That is a question that I had in my mind because...
No, it's a very good question. It's an excellent question. Isn't it the same? Here, let me give you the what I said with Google, right? Google example and the Microsoft example. Yes? Microsoft is thinking systems. If it's going to do AI and machine learning, which of course they're going to do, no?
Mm-hmm.
We need power source, which is huge and non-pollutant nuclear. So it buys for $2 million, $2 billion, 2.1 billion. And it's going to cost them more to reactivate it. It hasn't been activated since 1979. It's going to take 2 years to go online. But they understand that if they don't have a clean source of energy, they're going to continue to contribute to the problem, and they can't make claims that they're either carbon neutral or net zero are really plans that are meaningful. They're not meaningful if your source of power for those are contributory. Good question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have other questions? Or we can take 2 questions. We can take 3, 4, as many as you'd like. The rest of you who are here, is this making sense? Come on, let's be a community here. Nobody wants to chip in anything else here? Well, for those of you who are also interested, we have 4 other programs coming similar to this, and we have one on greenwashing. Whether you're a consumer or a business owner, I think the greenwashing is really critical. And we're doing that, I think, in 3 or 4 weeks. And then for those who want to think of carbon trading, how do we turn carbon into an asset where that asset is, in fact, a revenue producer? So carbon trading is real. And it's just like stock trading at NASDAQ or any of the international stock and bond trading markets. So this is something that I would strongly recommend you think about and you take a look at, and you perhaps participate in that seminar as well with me. Happy to have you here. Federico, what do you do?
I'm a lawyer.
Ah.
I practice in Italy. Yeah.
Ah, wonderful. Do you have clients? Because I mentioned some of the challenges, how the whole idea of supply system and the fact that you have 3 or 4 handoffs very often on a product development. Are you involved in the apparel industry as an attorney?
Oh yeah, sometimes I deal with the apparel industry, yeah, and I find this theme very interesting, especially because it's a cutting edge discussion, the one about the carbon dioxide neutrality or net production. Zero production.
Right, net zero. Yeah, yeah.
And it's a very relevant discussion according to the regulations that are conceiving environmental issues. And in Europe nowadays, we have these kind of regulations that are coming into force this period. So it's very important for me to keep in mind these problems for clients that are requiring this kind of consultancy.
No, you're absolutely true. And the EU is making, is empowering consumers in such a way that companies have to anticipate what consumers may need, for example, to, let's say, repair a product. I mean, in apparel, they used to put buttons on the inside of a shirt. But now the question is, should they put sewing kits with the buttons? How far do we go, right?
And we have this kind of outsourcing also for manufacturing that is likely a problem that is going to rise in this period as well, because due to the costs, many companies tend to, outsource, as I said, in third world countries, this kind of working.
Yes.
So another question would be, how can you, keep screening these kind of producers, third producers that are located outside the European Union? How can you control their doing?
That's an excellent question. There's a company that, I have a consulting practice here too in the apparel sector. But I do beyond apparel. I, just do luxury premium brands a lot. So Federico, there's a company in Florentine, Firenze, that makes beautiful handbags, designs, and have been around 40, 50 years, right? And one of the things they've done is to create a code of ethics and tied it into their HR department. And part of that is if you're going to do business with them, you have to sign, a supplier has to sign an agreement that they're going to abide by these standards. Now, you still have to, of course, go out from time to time and make visits, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what this company also does, they they go out with their internal audit personnel and external consultants. So they get a highly specialized review to make sure there's compliance to the standards that were signed off on. Now, that's really the way you have to do this. But again, you end up being a policeman by yourself because there's no external way in which you can easily find out whether they're adhering unless they do something terrible, of course, and break the law. So there is a process of surveillance. And again, if you sign a letter of commitment or design a letter of commitment, and again, this company is doing this in Italy because they're a client of mine here. And they show the code of ethics and they share the code of ethics. So they're very specific about what's required to do business with them. So the implication is, although it's not quite stated that way, if you don't follow this, then we can't make claims and you put us in a very, very bad light. And if we're in a bad light, maybe we need to change suppliers. No? So nobody says that because that's inappropriate. But the implication is there.
The problem is that I think very often this code of ethics used, just to prevent any possible claims that are concerning the way certain products are treated or are part of a, production procedure that is concerned to the working abroad. But I don't know how much then it basically can cover all the kind of, issues that can react, that can relate to this kind of production phase. You can sign up a code of ethics, but there's no guarantee for the fact that the third worker, follows this code of ethics. It's just, a balance of trust in some extent.
You just used the perfect phrase, a balance of trust. Yeah. But again, there's no global, international organization that has the authority or the power to do this. So it has to be done in the market fashion. So this is a market-driven solution. And again, what's the penalty for failure? Well, you say, you're going to be exposed as not trustworthy. And maybe other people find out and don't do business with you. And maybe at some point I have to cut back and eventually find another supplier. And as well as I do in Italy, this is very difficult because you have handoffs, yes? And a handoff and a handoff and a handoff of a product manufacturing process. So sometimes you don't know the handoffs. No?
And especially because in Italy, we have smaller companies that have smaller structures, and therefore they have a smaller capacity of checking the whole process.
Correct.
They have a smaller control over the, chain of processing a product.
No, you're absolutely right. And also it's the cost. If you're a small company, do you want to start going out with a, with a consultant and paying somebody? And, it's very hard to make ends meet when you're really operating on a shoestring kind of thing. Your expense and your income is very tight. So it's not easy. It's not easy, especially like you say in Italy, we have so many small, and again, very often craftsmen, yes, who, are really, really creative craftsmen, as well as business people and manufacturers, that are more concerned with the integrity of the product, than with the sustainability protocols by which it's made. Not that they're not responsible. It's their focus is as craftsmen, not necessarily, as sustainability practitioners. I think that's an issue. It's a cultural issue too. Well, this is great, Federico. And this is the kind of
It was
exchange.
great to meet
I
you.
hope this has been helpful. That's all.
Yeah.
Any answers? Have I given you any answers? I guess that's the good question.
Yeah, of course. That was very satisfactory. Thank you.
Okay. Well, look, feel free to, anything else comes up, just email me, okay?
Okay. Can you leave the email on the chat?
Yeah, sure. Let me do that right now. Yes? Where you can get me. All right? Ah.
I think the chat is disabled.
Oh, is it really? Okay, I'll give it to you. It's Bill, B-I-L-L.
Wait a second.
Don't worry, we're gonna send you an email with the slides,
Okay.
and Bill's gonna be copied in the email.
Oh,
So
Okay,
oh,
good.
fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
don't worry.
Okay, we are just about at the end of our chat. So, but feel free, any of you, to send me any questions you have, and I will certainly answer them for sure. And if you want to have a dialogue, happy to have that with you too. And thank you for
Perfect.
coming, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
So much. So much.
So if there are no more questions, thank you, Bill, and we can end this webinar.
Thank you,
Thank
man.
you.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao, everybody.
Thank you.